because we're from this continent. We want to see things work. We want to see Africa ought to be a bloody world power with all its resources and its water, its extractable resources.
Before child soldiers, because I think this is a space that executive outcomes has certainly must have crossed paths with as well. So if possible, can you talk to me about the motivations of founding executive outcomes?
The first time around, I was basically fired from the SADF. The unit I served in was terminated. Many of us weren't aware of the fact that it had been terminated. Politically, it was just kept quiet. And we found out days after the unit no longer existed that it no longer existed. And this was when the ruling National Party in South Africa in the late 80s suddenly took this left-wing turning, and decided that, there's going to be no more war. Peace is going to break out and last forever. And the unit I was served in was shut down. And of course, I didn't have any other skill but being a soldier. But I was very fortunate in that I was asked to train special forces in covert operations and human intelligence operations. And that's when I started executive outcomes. And the interesting part is that many people have been running around claiming they started executive outcomes, which they never did. And I've debated with them and asked them to please show the company registration forms, and they can't do it. So there are many con artists walking on this earth. But be that as it may, executive outcomes started training South African special forces in human intelligence operations and covert operations. Some of the men ended up being detached special forces guys or met with the De Beers Diamond Company's guys, because De Beers was suffering loss through the theft of diamonds, illegal diamond trade, diamonds being stolen, illegal mining, etc. And so I ended up in Botswana training a De Beers affiliate known as Debswana in how to counter the illicit diamond buying trade, either through penetration or infiltration agents.
It's hard to get your head around how large this mine is. It's one of the biggest holes in the world. This shovel behind me is 6 stories high. The mine itself is 2 miles wide and more than a quarter mile deep, and it's getting deeper every day. The land here is so valuable that officials won't even let me bend over and pick up a rock without asking for their permission. Even so, they've got to crush about a ton of rock to get just under 2 carats of rough diamonds. Moving all this rock around is no easy task. Some of the largest earth-moving equipment in the world is here. Just look at this thing. It can carry 300 tons of rock at any one time, and just the tires are 15 feet high.
During that period, I was approached by an oil company, a British oil company, who wanted to know if we could help them recover equipment on a harbor in Soyu, northwest Angola. They were under penalties because they couldn't continue their drilling operations because all their kit was on the harbor of Soyu. The problem was the harbor was under control of UNITA, and I agreed to it, that we would do it. Obviously, we were given a lot of incorrect intelligence, and that's one of the things we learned. Don't trust other people's intelligence. We'll trust our own. We ended up in Soyu, and some of the biggest fights that the guys had ever been in took place in Soyu because it was a UNITA stronghold. They didn't want the oil equipment recovered because that could be income for the MPLA government of Angola. The end result is the guys did incredibly well in Soyu and came to the attention of the Angolan High Command. who asked for a meeting, and I met them in Namibia, which is where we used to be based when we were fighting them. And it was a very interesting meeting because we first discussed the war and who was where and what units were you in, etc. And the mission given to me was actually, you destroyed the 16th Brigade, coming from the Angolans, now rebuild it. And that comment was made because I led a raid on the 16th Brigade in 1981 or 82. And the aftermath of that, the brigade was virtually wiped out through airstrikes and certain actions that had happened. But there was no animosity. It was a very strange experience to talk to these generals. And we said, fine, we will do that. So we ended up training the 16th Brigade, and it was there where the whole idea of composite warfare started formalizing in my mind, because in the days when I was a South African soldier, I thought there were things we could have done better and weren't doing better. And one example was the fact that there is no center of gravity in the wars we're fighting. The Clausewitzian theory of there's a center of gravity as the hub of all power and movement does not exist in an African conflict. There's a trinity of gravity. And that trinity of gravity consists of, obviously, the enemy, the anti-government force, the populace, and the financial flow of income to keep the enemy going. And if we could erode, neutralize two of those, the third would collapse. And that is why the campaign strategy to end the war in Angola was to recapture the diamond fields, because those diamond fields were fueling the war.
So this is how you got to work in Mozambique. This is how you got to work in Mozambique. This is the work bus.
Yep. Protecting themselves is one thing, but protecting their profit is another. Increased UNITA activity has corralled SDM onto just 1/3 of its total river lease. They still do well, but the rebels do better. Up to $700 million a year in illicit diamond mining and trading. And UNITA's $4 billion in accrued diamond profits have been prudently invested in the world's hottest stocks. Dragging diamonds out of the ground is clearly a lot easier than feeding the hungry.
Of course, it became an international thing that we're now taking the diamonds for ourselves, which is absolute rubbish. I can't pay people, you can get a diamond this month for pay and you can have 2 diamonds. It was just the stupidity and the naivety of the media and people in the media and people in government who were thinking this out. The aim was to take away the flow of funding. Simultaneously with that was to change the attitude of the local population. And the way in which we did that is by purifying water to immediately bring down waterborne diseases, especially amongst the kids. And we got a lot of hospitals in South Africa donating medicine that was time expired. And medicine that's time expired is still very, very good medicine. So we could fly that up and open clinics. And we worked a lot with some of the Roman Catholic clinics out in Angola, where we were providing them with medicine. It was given to us, so we were giving it to them. I mean, we were making money out of people's misery, but it became a huge issue in the international press as well, that we are now smuggling pharmaceuticals and we're smuggling diamonds. But we persevered, and we said to the Angolans, we just got to put our heads down. If we neutralize the funding and we neutralize the local population, we'll bleed the enemy to death on the battlefield. They will never be able to recover. And that's what happened. So within 18 months, 2 years, we entered a 30-year civil war. And it was also where the idea started, or we started realizing armies are being badly trained and armies are being set up to fail. You asked about the direction of the company, but that's what ultimately really forged the company. And it's interesting, we've been written out of the Angolan conflict by many academics and that. We don't care, nor do the Angolans care, because we know what happened. It was in Angola that we first started encountering the fact that there are child soldiers. Not many, but there were some with UNITA. And what happened was there were countless incidents where people did not succumb to UNITA threats to join their army, and they were summarily executed next to the road. And many of these were kids. So it was very, very vicious and a very brutal war. The Roman Catholic Church in Angola, because the majority of the Angolans were Roman Catholics, and that had come still from the times of the Portuguese, were very aware of the role the church was playing in terms of helping and trying to help, and they were. And I'm not a Roman Catholic, but they were really trying to do a lot of work, and good work. So we had no problem helping them. It caused an international outcry that we were giving water away, purified water, because a foreign government was no longer making money on exporting its water in bottles to Angola. But if we have to purify water for ourselves. If we're not going to drink the water, why must we waste it? So we started giving it to the locals. But it had an impact as well, because the locals started telling us what the enemy are doing. It was the clinics that were set up that were telling our guys what's happening and what the enemy's planning and what they're doing, that would tell them where caches are, where large fuel dumps were. So we could target all of these things, and that way, because the enemy no longer had access to diamonds, which I might say many were being sold, not many, all were being sold to foreign countries, and foreign countries were actually funding this war in Angola. Once they lost that, they couldn't replace anything. And the harbour town that we took in Soyu, which unbeknownst to us at that stage, was the principal harbour where equipment was being delivered for the anti-government group UNITA. We were stepping on a lot of toes, but we actually just had gone past the stage of caring, because this was about ending the misery of people. And that's where we also learned that we can sit and talk to our erstwhile enemies, and we can actually be totally brutally honest with each other. And there's no animosity. And even today, veterans go up to Angola on tours where the Angolan army welcomes them and the Angolan government welcomes them, and they visit the battlefields together. I mean, that's not something that happens elsewhere. My apologies.
I was just going to say, that's such a, it's such a unique trait to African soldiers. And so what is it? Is it like a respect for each other, fighting for your belief, for your nation? Like, what is that exactly? I rarely see it in other places. Occasionally you'll see, like a World War II veteran in the United States meet with his captor or something, and those are very touching, but, they're one-off stories. What is it about that? You talked about resilience earlier. If there's any definition of resilience, it's your ability to, come face to face with the person that almost took you out and, have a tea or a coffee or whatever together, so what is it about the experience that you have with each other that you're able to do that?
I think we all realize that we are being used by political leaderships, that we do what we do because of political instructions, in a sense, and that therefore, the Angolan soldier I'm fighting, he didn't decide that I'm his enemy and want to fight me. He's sent to fight me. The Swabo, the guy from Namibia soldier, To him, we've invaded his country. He wants us out of his country. So, but these are things, and we would discuss these. And I'm serious. There's never been animosity. We've captured enemies fighting governments in Africa, and we sit down and we talk to them. It's not a matter of we're going to, shock you with 10,000 volts and beat you to a pulp or anything. We sit down and we talk to them. And oftentimes they initially don't want to talk, and once they realize, but there's no animosity toward them in the sense that there's vengeance being sought, they talk. We spoke to Boko Haram guys. I have guys from an Islamist movement in Africa that have stayed here in my home with me. And I've spoken to them about that. And we've been able to convince them in a certain country not to disrupt the elections. And that's by talking to them. But no one's interested in this. And to us who sit down here, we say, we can do so much, but no one wants us to. And it's sad at times, and I'm not punting for work. We've got enough to keep ourselves busy with. Point I'm making is no one wants these conflicts to end because they are there for a purpose, and a lot of them are artificially fueled and kept alive in order to secure resources and to exert control. That's all it's about. It's not about bringing peace. If it was, why is all the money that's spent on this continent yielded so few results? But there's been none.
What was the view of USAID being canceled? When there's such a reliance on NGOs and a reliance on international aid, especially in parts of the world like Africa, was it sort of a big picture relief, or was it an insult? I'm just curious, as you were talking, I was thinking of the soft diplomacy and the soft power of clean water.
Well, I think there are many that are very pleased that USAID is no more or not capable of. Of course, there are people that relied on it, but many of those people were senior government people who were pocketing a lot of the money. And I think people who are really disappointed are those anti-government forces they've been supporting, which they were. And it was in one of your Senate hearings where it came out that they were even funding Boko Haram. And that made continental news on what USAID was really doing. So, there's a lot of good that could be done, but there was a lot of damage done as well. And I think part of the problem is that there's no control over these agencies. They have their own budgets, and they go off on their own mission and their own tangent. And that mission or tangent doesn't necessarily align with the US's national strategy and its foreign strategy. And I think there things fall off because there's no control.
Interesting. And, one other angle that I think goes overlooked sometimes is the amount of economic reliance. I understand why it is that we do it and the importance of soft power diplomacy. And you even alluded to it a little earlier in Angola. But, it's in the long term, it is just, handouts. And that is never good in the long term resilience economically for a nation.
I think you create a culture of almost entitlement with handouts. And we've often said we don't understand why the money being given to these areas in Africa, why there's no control over it. Because there isn't. To us, and I use a simple example, it's very difficult with foreign armies because foreign companies that do what we do are sponsored, by their home governments. We're not. A government has to pay for us. So if the Angolans want us, no one gives us the money but the Angolan government. So we live with those troops. We eat what they eat. We do everything with them. We speak different languages. We have different cultures. We have different traditions. But we respect each other's stuff. And we know what to expect from them. The point I'm trying to make is that we don't come in and go and stay in a hotel, and eat three-course meals a day or 5-course meals a day. If those troops we are with eat rice and beans, that's what we eat, rice and beans. And very quickly, we build up a relationship with them that we're willing to do what they're doing. If they go to battle, we go with them because we train them. These are our guys. And we want to make very sure they do what they're supposed to do. And of course, the world hates that. But we don't care anymore.
The way that you go about your business is effective and unique and very direct and, probably cost effective too. If you think of, who was I listening to? I was listening to someone that did like a cost benefit analysis of like the war in Afghanistan, what it cost us from the US standpoint versus if we would have just used a private military contractor as a stand behind or a stay behind. In Afghanistan, it would have been the magnitude less than what we actually spent in the trillions of dollars, and not to mention the withdrawal. I'm not even going to get into that because that'll get my gears grinding.
Well, let me say the following, if I may.
Please.
We do not blame the foreign soldiers that come in to train in Africa for the bad training that they're giving. And I'll tell you why I say that. They, once again, are told they're given boxes to tick. We don't have boxes to tick, number one. Number two, they come in with a skewed lens. An American soldier will look at, for example, the Nigerian army through an American lens. You cannot do that. Because one of the fundamentals of war is that intelligence drives your strategy. Your strategy determines your structure. So that's why we don't have sections and platoons and battalions. We've changed that where we work. Your doctrine is determined by your terrain and the enemy. Because remember, doctrine tells us what we can do, not what we must do. It tells us how to do things, not what to do. Okay? So now, this European soldier comes into Africa and he must now teach African soldiers, for want of a better word, fieldcraft. Just using a basic thing. We always ask, according to whose doctrine? Because you cannot superimpose a Western or an Eastern doctrine on an African army and think it's going to work. It won't. And there's many reasons for that. But I always ask, according to whose doctrine? Because doesn't that tell us how to do things? And if we don't know what doctrine we're following, how the hell are we going to train him properly? So we have all these questions that we've converted into our own way of doing things. And I've written about this, and where we've applied it, it's worked. And it's worked because the process is simple, I think. But again, let me say that the soldier coming in to train the African army, we don't blame him. We never blame the African soldier because the problem lies elsewhere. And a lot of that problem, when it comes to foreign training, has to do with box ticking. We don't tick boxes. We train very mission specific, and we work with those troops, we go with them, and we make sure that that mission is attained. Because we're from this continent, we want to see things work. We want to see Africa ought to be a bloody world power with all its resources and its water, its extractable resources, its abilities. But it's not. We're forever handing out the beggar's bowl, saying, please give us money. And someone joked about it yesterday. He said we should have a cap that also says MAGA, M-A-G-A. And that will stand for Make
Right.
Africa Grovel Again. I think just at the end of the day, we could achieve so much more. And that's why I said I think, and again, I'm giving you my opinion, that the approach to militarize Africa was completely wrong. And because of that, it's opened the door to a whole lot of other things. It's opened a Pandora's box, and that has resulted in a lot of what people term terrorism on the continent now. Whereas the East has come in with this whole thing of developing and, we're going to build this and we're going to do that, which they do, often cheaply. But in people's minds, the perception of people is, look what the Chinese have built for us. And it's all about perceptions because, people's perceptions impact on everything, on law enforcement, intelligence, army, the economy, governance, the whole lot. So it's about winning people's minds. And you're not going to do that by militarizing them or training them badly or, ignoring their cultures and their traditions or telling them they think you can't, pray towards a tree. His ancestors prayed to that tree. So who are you to tell him he can't? I'm trying to put this simplistically, but that's how we see it. And we're passionate about this continent. If we weren't, we'd have left a long time ago. But we want to see things work.
Yeah. And do you think that opportunity is there do you think the cohesion and the, united vision for the potential for Africa to become a great power is there? Or are the leaders too corrupt? Honestly, is it, it's not in their interest to, empower the African continent necessarily when they're thriving off of the chaos and the lawlessness.
Well, absolutely. I think many governments are very happy with the status quo because they're making money out of it. But I think there's a generation of youngsters coming up that actually have the potential to turn things around, and I think they want to. I think the unity will be there once governments start holding irresponsible media to account. I'm not talking of censoring the media. I'm saying irresponsible media, where blatant disinformation is being pumped out in order to create antagonism and disunity. I think it can. And I think that aid money coming in needs to be controlled, because if it isn't, it goes back into the pockets of people who actually don't deserve it. And that's why, to me, you see them in the 5-star hotels and their big air-conditioned Prados and their 3-4 meals a day that they eat, and they like to go out for photo ops. Those things must be stopped because they're doing more damage to the image of wanting to do something for the continent than anything else. And then, of course, they sometimes encourage the villagers to rise up against the government. We've heard them do that. So, there's a lot of things, but it all goes back to governments being held to account. Because if governments are allowed to get away with the corruption and no one's vetting these organizations coming in, we're going to have this chaos. I think I'm talking your ears off your head.
No, I love it. Are you kidding me? Even so, the early days of executive outcomes, your first mission, which you mentioned, was to secure the oil asset. When you were looking at this, did you have the capacity in place, or, were you quickly scattering, looking for your first group of guys that were going to come join you in this venture? And also, how did you fund that first mission?
Well, when I was told about the problem at Soya and asked, can you solve it? I immediately said yes, because I knew it couldn't be that big of a problem. But I also had a lot of guys I'd worked with over many years that had also lost their jobs, that came from similar units as what I did. And it was making a few phone calls and suddenly I had all the men. So getting the people together wasn't the problem. I couldn't fund it because I just didn't have the money. I mean, when I was retrenched, I never even got my pension. So after years and years in the armed forces, I left with virtually nothing. But the oil company, the CEO of the oil company, I said to him, look, we can do this, but I don't have the money to do it. And he said, well, you will give us the money to do it in advance, which allowed me to say to everyone, look, we can now guarantee your money to you. The problem became complicated when it was known in South Africa that we were going to go and secure this harbour town. And suddenly we had this huge media assault on us, and on me in particular. But the whole intention was to stop executive outcomes. But the men were there and the funding was there. So I was in a very fortunate position that I didn't have to go to a bank, which I wouldn't have got the money from anyway. And I just knew a lot of the right men. And some of those men stayed in the company until the day it closed its doors for the first time.
Wow. Okay. So let's get into the business side of things. Those first men, how did you come up with the wage structure? What were the incentives that you were giving? This was obviously a new venture. It's a startup, and there was
Very
no
much.
model to sort of replicate, be like, hey, this worked out great in, Kazakhstan or something. No, this never existed unless you really go back. What were those early days like? Like you were young, now let go of soldier, and you had this great ambition. Did you feel also like that sense of purpose and drive on your end that you're doing exactly what it is that you're destined to do? Was there almost a feeling of finding purpose? And that everything that you had experienced led you up to the creation of this outfit?
I think in a way, yes. But allow me to also say that, once again, I was incredibly fortunate that there were very good men who I could use as a soundboard and say, look, this is what we intend to do. How do you think we should be doing it? Our biggest problem was that the South African media published a disinformation piece stating that going to the harbour town is just a cover story. Our intention is to go and kill the leader of the opposition. So, of course, that created a huge danger to everyone. And it took convincing the Angolan army to arm guys who were fighting them just a few years before, to say, look, we're going to go and do this job, but we need your guns, so give us the weapons, which they eventually relented. And I didn't go up with him because it was, the company had been going for some time already, training special forces and training De Beers' people and that. But this was the first big sort of military contract, although it was actually a security contract, that had come our way. And I've always believed that your logistics footprint must be very lean, light, and adaptable. So to run the whole logistics for this operation, I stayed behind because I had to purchase the food, I had to pay the salaries, I had to arrange with hospitals if people got sick, I had to arrange the leave, etc. And I had someone with me. So we were two guys running the logistics for this whole thing. And everyone else was up in Soyu. And I think what happened on the ground was that certain guys displayed unbelievable leadership on the ground. And as contracts started coming, they were then given those positions to exercise that leadership because the men had learned to trust them. I had learned to trust them because of the decisions they could make. So, it then just sort of snowballed because Soyu was in many ways the crucible in which the known executive outcomes was forged. And, that I still look back in almost wonderment at what the guys did, because they were attacked time and time and time again by massive groups of UNITA. and they were just 50 guys on the ground, and they kept that harbour. They didn't, although in the end they had to leave because then they were attacked by, which was probably about 5,000 men. But in this UNITA attack, we killed Moroccan soldiers. We, not I, but the company. There were Moroccan soldiers there. There were some European soldiers there. And no one was interested in hearing what's going on. And we know why the Moroccans were there. You know, the West was supporting UNITA, and Morocco has always been very much aligned to the West. And I think there was a belief in the West by people driving this conflict that Moroccan soldiers would add value to the rebel forces. So we weren't mad at the Moroccans. I mean, we understood the political dynamics of what's going on. But it was at that little harbour town called Soyu where the guys discovered the first horrors of UNITA, where our divers got, because we had to open up the harbour as well, found containers in the water filled with bodies that had been put in there and dumped in the harbour. So all these had to be recovered from the harbour. And I think it also made the guys realize that, you know what, we have to stop this from happening. So I think there were, of course, the guys that were there only to get the money because, you know, they didn't have jobs anymore. But there were guys who were there who felt they really wanted to make a big difference.
And did you lose any men on that mission?
Yes, unfortunately. Lost 3 very good guys. And when I say, you know, everyone always says good guys lost. One served with me in 3-2 Battalion's reconnaissance wing. And 2 of the 2 others, I knew one of them. Two were my friends. Several guys got wounded. But again, I go back to, you know, I've used the term resilience, and I haven't used it lightly. It just showed the resilience of this group of guys. And let me just say that they weren't all whites, again. And they weren't all SADF or ex-SADF apartheid soldiers. There were some ex-ANC guys. Their military women joined as well. So we had a whole lot of people, but they were all from South Africa. And I think that is what made the Angolans sit up and take note to say, you know, maybe these enemies we had a few years ago can help us end the war.
Eeben, you know, it's one thing to fight alongside your brothers and you're operating under the orders of the political leaders at the time. And it's completely different that you're leading now this company and to lose men under your watch and under your umbrella. What did that do to you? Does that, I mean, as a leader, how did you cope with that? And what was the emotional toll that had on you?
Oh, I think it was massive. You know, I think whether you're in a government force, whether it be a military or a law enforcement or an intelligence unit, or in a private security company, losing colleagues is never easy. I think that the advantage you have if you're with a government organization is that you have a huge support structure. This little company at that stage had no support structure. And in many ways, if anything, I am to blame for that because I should have foreseen that. But I didn't, and I thought we're all young and bulletproof. We made it through a very difficult war and survived, and there's no ways anything's going to happen to us now. So when the first reports came in of people lost, my immediate thought was that we have to get to their next of kin and warn them, tell them what had happened, as much as information as we had, and 3 of the bodies we could never recover. 2 of the bodies we could never recover. So we were never even able to give those families closure. But again, the guys knew one another, and 2 of the men that were lost, their best mates up there said, could they please come and tell the families? So we immediately flew them down to go and speak to the families and say what had happened. But I think that the most bitter I've ever felt in my life was the way that the media rejoiced at this. They had caused it, and now they were rejoicing. And it wasn't just this local lot of media people, it was international. And I think, again, it just made us bitter because it wasn't in the Eastern newspapers, it was in the Western newspapers that we were now being, first attacked for going there, then using the media to actually warn the rebels about something that was not going to happen, and then this jubilation that some of the men had been killed. And I think it hardened us a lot in how we would start dealing with the media after that. Of course, the media kept up its assaults right throughout. And the biggest problem in retrospect is we never had a voice because social media didn't exist. And the only media we had was the legacy media, whether it be the newspapers or the radio or the television. So it hardened us in many ways and made us incredibly cynical in terms of what we hear on the radio or, read in a newspaper or see on television. We start doubting everything. But that's what it did. It was a very bitter, emotional period, that.
And I can see how those lessons would have been very difficult pills to swallow, especially, when you said you feel young and bulletproof, and, the media angle is interesting hearing you talking about that, because here you say you had no social media and all of that, yet, when I talk to American Special Forces, Green Berets, that served in Vietnam, you had a form of media that was word of mouth that was incredible, and the positivity about the company quickly spread. And I would love to know, what your view of, the Green Berets, were there Green Berets that joined Executive Outcomes? Oh, there weren't.
No.
Oh, okay.
No.
I guess they wanted to, but there were like prohibitions from being able to join or something, I assume.
Yeah, I think also, that we could only take a certain amount of people because of the budget which we had to work in. And so we would opt for people that we knew from the continent, that had either served with us or that we'd worked with in other armies, because they would not have to go through a process of being almost desensitized to the continent itself, and they knew how we operate. So in many ways, we wouldn't go for people outside the continent. There were one or two who came in, and our way of going to war is very different from the European way of going to war. So no, we didn't get any of them in. We had some people from the UK join us in Nigeria, but that was under a different company. And now Executive Outcomes is once again just African-based.
Interesting. Thank you for correcting that. I think a lot of people just assume that, because there was so much popularity of your company. So the selection process, what were you looking for when it came to the African soldier? Was it a special forces background, intelligence, reconnaissance, infantry, a little of everything? What made some of the best?
I think, let me first say that if we are in any country we're working in, we become part of that country's armed forces, which is another thing people don't understand. And there's a reason why we do that. And that reason is that I, as, Mr. Jones, carries no authority to an African soldier, but I, as Colonel Jones or Major Jones or Sergeant Jones, immediately I have authority and I will be listened to. So we become part of the National Army. We wear their uniforms, we have their ranks, we have their identity. So we're part of that army. And we train very mission specific. So if the mission is, for an example, a hostage rescue mission, we have a criteria that we go through. We've been through hostage rescues. We did the rescue in Irian Jaya for the Indonesian army, although other armies claimed responsibility for it. They never did. We did it. We have an understanding of certain operations, and we know the type of man that we will be looking for. Of course, there's an intelligence component. So we want the intelligence officer to carry the same amount of respect as the infantryman, to have the same amount of respect as the sapper, to have the same amount of respect as the mortarman or the medic or whatever. So they're all, irrespective of their rank, for their selection process, they have no rank. They each get a number, and that's a standard thing in many armies, so they get a number. And they are literally pushed day and night to make sure that they have the mental fortitude, that physically they can cope with it, and that they never get to a point where they realize they can't do it anymore. We want to push them up to a point, and from that point, we start building them up. So the intelligence officer will train with the infantry. He will be as good an infantryman as the infantryman. But the time will come that we'll take him out, and he will then go and just do intelligence work, and we'll train him for that, and we'll control him. But then, once we've put the unit together, because I said the strategy is driven by intelligence determines the structure, and that structure tells us what we need, because that structure is focused on the ends of the campaign strategy. What must we achieve? So we approach this differently, I think, from most other people, but to us, we've had success with it, and we're not going to change it. If you look at Nigeria, the mission was initially to rescue the Chibok girls, which changed very quickly and went into an offensive operation to counter Boko Haram, about to overrun 7th Division at Maiduguri, which is the Borno state, northeastern Nigeria. We have to be able to very quickly adapt to a new mission and prepare those troops very quickly. But if we haven't selected them correctly, we're not going to be able to do it. So in the case of Nigeria, as an example, we had to teach them vehicle drills on the way from where we were based initially at the Nigerian Army School of Infantry to Maiduguri. So that section of road we had to use as a training and combat preparation phase for them. But we wouldn't have been able to manage it if the troops themselves weren't willing to learn and to do things. And we wouldn't have been able to do it if we were unable to adapt and we didn't have a proper strategy in place.
Very insightful. And, you mentioned one thing that I'd also like to go back with. It's about how the Western soldier is not necessarily trained to be able to fully understand the African, I'm summarizing here, but like the African terrain. Earlier, when you were talking about one of the people that were killed being chopped up and boiled and eaten, I mean, that's not really something that, from an American perspective, we're used to hearing, let alone seeing.
Well, he was
we
an
don't
American.
train for this.
He was an American.
That happened to?
Yes, he was a Green Beret who joined the Rhodesian army, and they went to Sierra Leone, and they met a very cruel fate there. But he was chopped up, boiled, and eaten. And that is, what does happen sometimes. So it's very gruesome. But it's not only that, it's the terrain. It's not the same as Europe, where, the US Army, the British Army, the German Army, the French Army are all being prepared for fighting on European soil to counter an enemy from the East. In Africa, you don't have the infrastructure, the water facilities, the medical facilities. you have very little, so you have to make do with what you have. And if you don't have it, you just don't have it. And it becomes very taxing.
Can we talk a moment about some of these tragic American losses in Africa? I did not know that this incident that you were referring to in Sierra Leone was an American Green Beret. You know, I think when we think of Americans in Africa, we immediately think of the Battle of Mogadishu. And, you know, the terrain obviously played a component in that as well. What were your views about some of the failures there? And, you know, I know as well, you talk about the abandonment of the West, but I know from a U.S. perspective, there's always that moment where it's like, okay, done. Like we're not involved in this anymore. And I think to the American public sentiment, that's when that happened. What do you think happened? And, you know, what are the losses of our disengagement at that point?
You're talking specifically of Mogadishu?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think...
Like we're with executive outcomes when that happened, right? So you guys must have seen this unfolding at the time.
To us, it was a matter of... It was the West. And again, forgive me, but it was the West that had allowed... I think he was General Aidid, who became that warlord, that had been funding and supporting this guy all along. And then suddenly they wanted to take him out. Our opinion was at that stage, this is going to take a lot more than just a force to rush in there, because those guys have got old 303 caliber rifles. We call them Lee Metfords, with iron sights. And I still said they're going to engage you at 400 meters with these things. And technology is going to fail because it's not a technology-friendly area. We hadn't been to Mogadishu, but we'd, seen photographs and had a good idea what's going on from the Somalis we'd spoken to. And I think, therefore, that the soldiers who went in did the very best they could do under a very, very difficult condition. But I think the plan was skewed. Because if you really look at what was achieved with it, it did a huge blow to the morale of the American nation. You can't.
It still does.
This was the Battle of Mogadishu, also known as the Black Hawk Down episode. It was one of the most notorious and ill-fated fights in recent U.S. history. The U.S. military presence started as an effort to provide security for food relief missions to a famine-struck Somali populace. But gradually, the U.S. started trying to target a local warlord named Mohammed Farah Aidid, and the humanitarian intervention suddenly morphed into a fierce street battle against militant clans. After Somali militants shot down 2 U.S. Black Hawk helicopters, efforts to rescue crew members would leave hundreds of Somalis and 18 U.S. servicemen dead, with dozens more wounded. Now, 20 years after the horrific battle, the U.S. footprint in Africa has ranged from non-intervention in the Rwandan genocide during the Clinton administration to President Obama's enforcement of a no-fly zone in Libya. In some ways, U.S. military engagement in Africa is expanding. Everything from drone bases to training missions are part of the footprint. And that's because the northern part of the continent is seeing no shortage of conflict, from roving gunmen in Mali to the extremist group Al-Shabaab operating out of Somalia. But while these engagements represent a ramp-up of sorts, the strong U.S. reluctance to put boots on the ground to counter these threats is still influenced by the battles in Somalia 20 years ago. For the Wall Street Journal, this is Mark Scheffler in New York.
You can't just rush into a place. There's a whole process to develop a plan. And if you don't know your enemy, he knows how you think, but you never learn to understand his thinking. You're not going to defeat him, because he's going to preempt you all the time. And that's what they did. I mean, just the use of school kids or children to give early warning, to be able to use radios to warn people elsewhere, to say, listen, they're coming. None of this was considered. And to us, these are things we look for on the ground. If we're working in an area and suddenly there are no kids, there's something very wrong going on in this area. Or if there's a whole lot of kids and no women. We know the kids are there to act as a shield for something. So there's all these battle indications you look for. Stupid stuff. Cattle on a road. It's intended to stop you. Once you stop, you're vulnerable in an ambush. So are you looking at this road properly tactically, or are you just driving down the road? And I think these are things that the foreign troops are not really trained in and don't always understand.
Yeah.
And he comes with the best intention to teach you something, but there's this missing gap that he doesn't have. That's not his fault. He's doing what he can do. But the problem is that the African soldier sits and listens and says, well, you know what? We've been fighting this war for the past 15 years. He's been in the army for 4 years. How is he going to teach us anything? And it immediately also sets up a line of distrust.
Yeah, those nuances are, something that I think needs to be paid much more attention to. You need to have somebody local to really be able to pick up on those. That's where the value of a group like Executive Outcomes, being that you're, indigenous to that area, like you understand it. So you mentioned as well about logistics at one point and the importance of being able to control your logistics.
We were operating at a greater distance away from home. So the logistics guys basically had to rewrite the book on how to do logistics to make sure. And I must admit that they were very, very good. They did it. I don't know how, but they did it. And the
you always
the way,
want a good logistics guy.
Absolutely. And if ever they came and said, look, we have a problem, my retort to them was, I don't pay you to tell me problems, sort it out. And they would go and sort it out and come and tell me how they did it. And it allowed them to start thinking much broader than what they were thinking. They could suddenly start, imagining this is what's going to happen. They could predict how much ammunition is going to be used, as a simple example, and make sure that the reserves are ready to be moved from Luanda to wherever it had to be moved. So they became very adept at that. And I like to think it's because they were forced to start thinking and to think critically about things, and not just, we're in the army, we'll just go and draw from the B echelon and push it up to the F echelon or whatever. There were no echelons. So we had to make a decision that in any mechanized advance, there will be no echelons, because echelons will hamper the way we do logistics.
It's another word for bureaucracy.
Yeah. So, but we could do it. And I think it took an enormous amount of mental agility on the part of the logisticians to say, okay, this is how we're going to do it. And it could get to a point where the logistics guys would say, well, you can't do that because we know we cannot support you. So it was just very interesting. It was in the old SADF, a logistics guy could never tell me I cannot do something because he can't support me. He had better support me. But with us, the logistics guy can say, no, you can't do that. We can't support you.
But, it's so empowering. Like it seems like your leadership style is one that is, very trusting of the team that you have around you. So can you talk a little about that? Like, what is your leadership style? And is it because you're so close and tight, and maybe, as Executive Outcomes started to expand, how do you maintain that level of trust and the leadership? Did it change as the company started to scale?
I think part of it changed, yes, because it was no longer a matter of I'm giving you an order to go and do something. I was no longer in a position to order anyone. We weren't part of a national army, the South African army, but we were part of the Angolan army or the Sierra Leonean army. So the approach was that no leader will give instructions that he cannot do himself. So the leaders also have to prove themselves to a huge extent. And that proof isn't only in being able to develop a plan, it's being able to be there while the plan is being unpacked. And when things go wrong, to make immediate adjustments, to get the support and the trust of the men. So a lot of it got built on trust. You know, of course, there's always a bad apple or two in a barrel, but there weren't many of them. And to me, it was actually a great privilege to be able to say to guys, okay, this is what I want us to do. This is where I want us to be. This is the timeline we're working on. This is the budget we have. Come back and tell me how we're going to do it. And to allow them to go and develop that plan or campaign strategy or operational design independently, and then come back to me and say, we're going to present it to you. And they present it to me and to the intelligence officer and to the logistics officer so that we can understand this, that we can support this thing, and that we can play devil's advocate on the plan. So I think it's really getting everyone engaged as much as possible. Obviously, there are sometimes security hazards involved that you have to be wary of. If we go into a serious planning session, the guys will be isolated. There will be no cell phones. There will be no radios. Everything will be done through a person walking there, getting an instruction and walking back to me or to whoever to maintain security. Because within Africa, you will often find in a national army might be sympathizers of the anti-government forces. So we don't want to compromise anything we're doing. And when we present that plan, ultimately it gets presented to the government's, the chief of the defense force, chief of defense staff, chief of the army, whatever you want to call him, so that he knows what we're intending to do. And ultimately he then decides, okay, you can do it or you can't do it. So there's a whole hierarchy we have to follow as well. But when it comes to leadership, I think all the guys in senior positions view conflict and war the same way I do. I think we think a lot alike because we know each other for so long, and it makes it very easy to exercise control over people. The trainers that go with us, or mentors, or whatever the world wants to call us, they integrate into that army, as do we, but the soldiers know that these guys are here to teach us. And so immediately we actually have their ear. And we do BT with them. We eat the same food they eat. So, we live with them. And they quickly get to understand that we are part of them. And that builds the respect as well. I was saying someone was saying to me the other day, he remembers we were somewhere, which is a few years ago, and every morning during this operation, one of the soldiers would come to where I was, sleeping under a bush, and say to me, "Sir, can I carry your rucksack?" And this soldier is already loaded with his rucksack, yet he wants to come and carry my rucksack. And all it does is it says to you that they trust us. They're not doing it. He's not asking to carry it because I'm going to give him a cigarette or a bar of chocolate. I don't have that. He wants to carry it because he respects what we've done and how we are with them all the time. So I think that helps a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you mentioned a rucksack. What are you typically carrying? Like, what are things in your rucksack that you're like, I would never do? I would never not have these with me in warfare in Africa?
Well,